all for coming inside on such an incredibly beautiful day. My name is Hildy Tao. I'm the curator of education at Woodmere Art Museum, and we are thrilled today to have Dr. Diane Turner speak on a photographer we've all been thrilled to learn about, John Mosley. Dr. Turner has been the curator of Temple University's renowned Charles L. Blockson's Afro-American Collection since 2007. For those of you who may not know, the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection is one of the most notable university-based collections in the country for books, prints, pamphlets, manuscripts, slave narratives, music, broadsides, letters, and artifacts of Afro-American life. And we are extremely grateful in the curatorial process for the user easiness in their website, because it's been enormous in terms of putting together this exhibition. And I know that our curators worked with Dr. Turner in terms of collecting information and material for this exhibition. Dr. Turner is an author of many books. We were just talking, and there are many more than are on any website anywhere. But one of the ones I'm familiar with is Feeding the Soul, Black Music, Black Thought, a collection of essays, interviews, poetry, and personal narratives about the evolution of black music. There's a children's book that she's authored called My Name is Oni Judge, and tells the true story of a young African woman who was a slave for George Washington and escapes despite attempts to recapture her. Dr. Turner has worked at the African American Museum of Philadelphia. She's developing materials for Lest We Forget Museum of African American Slavery in Philadelphia. She's a former professor of Black Studies at Camden County College and Rowan University, and many other places that we've discussed, as well as working on many new projects, including a new project on Philadelphia jazz, which we are very excited to learn about as that happens. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Turner. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank you for coming out today. I'd like to share with you my view of John W. Mosley, cultural warrior. First, I would like to thank the Woodmere Museum for inviting me to give this presentation. It is made possible because of John W. Mosley photographic collection housed in the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection, Temple University Library. In 1984, the collection was donated to historian, author, and bibliophile Charles L. Blockson by Clarence Still, who was married, whose sister married John W. Mosley. Clarence Still was the patriarch of the Still family. I don't know how many of you know about the Still family, but they're part of William Still, who wrote the Underground Railroad. The collection contains an estimated 300,000 photographs, prints, and negatives. I'd like to start this in the words of Dr. Charles L. Blockson, and this is a quote. "The Mosley photographs reflect the continuity of culture and introduce the viewer to important values that have withstood the test of time. They not only represent Philadelphia, but the experiences and relationships of African Americans in cities throughout the United States. They are a testimony to the existence of an African American humanity that warms the heart and soul as it stimulates the eye." John W. Mosley was an African-American self-taught photojournalist who documented African-American history and culture in Philadelphia. His passion for photography led him to become a professional photographer, working in the field for over 30 years. The following presentation portrays Mosley as a cultural warrior. I consider Mosley as a cultural warrior because as a photojournalist, he had great vigor, courage, and dedication, aggressively documenting Black life in Philadelphia and surrounding areas. He was prolific, known to photograph at least 4 events daily. He often worked 7 days a week. Just a note that I put, he didn't drive a car. He walked everywhere and was everywhere, and everybody knew and loved John W. Mosley in Philadelphia. Also, he was very creative, using photography as a medium of cultural resistance to racism. He deconstructed stereotypes. Here's an image of Charles Blockson, John W. Mosley. Carter G. Woodson, known as the father of African American history, once stated that, and this is a quote by Carter G. Woodson, "He who controls the image controls the mind," end quote. Mosley not only empowered himself, but also African Americans in Philadelphia by capturing the African American experience in its beauty, diversity, and complexity, which was very different from the images being presented in American popular culture, especially film. Beginning with his early life, I offer you a glimpse of John W. Mosley's legacy as a cultural warrior through the lens of his photographs. Mosley became part of a larger tradition in the African American community, which emerged in the late 19th century. They struggled to usurp power from creators of American popular culture and mass media. One example of such heroes was filmmaker Oscar Micheaux. They provide African Americans with a platform to tell their own stories and define who they are. John W. Mosley was born in 1907 in Lumberton, North Carolina, just miles from Raleigh. The year he was born, Alain Locke graduated from Harvard College and was selected as a Rhodes Scholar, becoming the first Black to receive the award. There's John Mosley's photograph of Alain Locke at Lincoln. Another of Alain Locke with Duke Ellington, and these are in Philadelphia. That same year, Meta Valtz Warwick Fuller became the first Black woman artist to receive a federal commission to craft 150 Black figurines for the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition. Later, she would receive a gold medal for her works. Another event in 1907 was the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that railroads may racially segregate passengers traveling between states. John Mosley's father was a Baptist minister and also worked as a barber. He instilled Mosley with religious values at a very early age. Besides his ministry, John's father worked as a barber so that his wife could stay home with their children. John's sister, Caroline, became a teacher and was a role model for her younger brother. She taught in a private boarding high school where John and one of his brothers attended. John learned the value of a good education early. During high school, he played football, but also enjoyed tennis and ping pong, as well as chess and checkers. Mosley later attended Johnson C. Smith College in Charlotte, North Carolina. His interest in photography began in the 20s. As stated in The Journey of John W. Mosley, an African-American pictorial album, and I quote, "He became fascinated with the art from a simple box camera. He was thrilled by his ability to set forth living action into a permanent visual record. He recognized in that instance that photography, from the moment of its invention, was one of the most moving and powerful instruments of communication to be devised." In 1934, Mosley migrated to Philadelphia, along with a number of other people who were migrating from the South at that time. 1934 was considered one of the worst years of the Great Depression. That year, Langston Hughes' first collection of short stories, The Ways of White Folks, was published. Mosley was hired at the Barksdale Photography Studio located at 8th and Market, and it was here that he began to hone his technical skills. Shortly thereafter, Mosley's photographs began appearing in African American newspapers throughout the northeastern United States, primarily the Philadelphia Tribune, as well as newspapers such as the Evening Bulletin. For the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on film and compare it to what John Mosley was doing, because we are left with the legacy of early cinema, and it really impacts us today in popular culture. It also provides one with an opportunity to look at John Mosley's photographs and compare them in contrast with the grotesque, stereotypical images that emerged on the silver screen. Mosley, as cultural warrior, fought against the insidious nature of racism in American society, which perpetrated a long tradition of stereotypes that made its way to film and television. So let's take a look. Cinema developed in an atmosphere where social Darwinism and eugenics paradigms dominated the meaning of race. These paradigms or models promoted the idea of a natural hierarchy of human cultures and histories, with Anglo-Saxons and other Caucasians at the top. Biological determinism, a racist classification, supported the ideology of white supremacy by placing Mongoloids and Negroids at the bottom of human development. As a consequence, early motion picture denigrated African Americans. Some of the first films with images of African Americans were whites in blackface. Clyde Taylor, in his important study, The Mask of Art, Breaking the Aesthetic Contract, Film and Literature, writes, quote, "Under the mask of racial and moral darkness, hidden desires could be exercised and indulged in public performance, be glamorized and applauded," end quote. Taylor goes on to provide an analysis of the menstrual mechanism as negrophilia. He states that negrophilia is the most lavishing put on display in minstrel shows. William Selleck's extreme fascination with African Americans moved him from minstrel to film producer with racist shorts between 1902 and 1903, entitled Interrupted Crap Game, Prize Fight in Coontown, and A Night in Blackville. In 1903, Edward S. Porter, a mechanic who turned to movie directing, filmed a 12-minute motion picture of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom was slightly overweight white actor made up in blackface. In 1904, William Paley and William F. Steiner released Avenging a Crime, depicting a blackface caricature of a murderer who killed a white woman and was lynched by a white mob. That same year, Biograph Films released Nigger in the Woodpile and Chicken Thief. The early racist shorts coded black males as barbaric, criminal, childlike, subhuman, and requiring supervision or bondage. In general, blacks were portrayed as lazy, shiftless, watermelon-eating, dancing darkies, thieves, dishonest, threatening to white society. Donald Bogle wrote a study of these stereotypes that emerged in a film entitled Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, An Interpretive History of Blacks in American Films. And that was published in 1994. Also in 1904, Thomas Edison exploits his coon stereotype in films such as 10 Pickaninnies. The coon was portrayed as a clown or harlequin and an object of amusement. In 1905, movies such as Wooding and Wedding of a Coon appeared, depicting a black couple as stumbling and stuttering idiots. In terms of females, you had the tragic mulatto who was cursed as a product of miscegenation, having one black parent and one white parent. She was not accepted or fit in either the black world or the white world. Films depicting the mulatto included The Debt, and in 1913 you had In Humanity's Cause, In Slavery Day, and The Octoroon. You also had the mammy stereotype, the very strong-headed, dark-skinned, big in stature, and very fat, who is quarrelsome and irritable. Aunt Jemima is a variation of the mammy. This slide here actually represents a person, an actor who's non-black in blackface, and it's from, anybody know, this is from Birth of the Nation. In 1911, the Tom character appeared in two films, The Confederate Spy and Massa's Sake. In the first, black-faced Tom sacrifices his life for his master, and in the second, he sacrifices his freedom. In 1927, James Lowe, whose image is up there, played a leading role as Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Image of Aunt Jemima. Another film Hollywood did, Hallelujah, which is just filled with stereotypes. The Blood of Jesus is on the vein of Oscar Micheaux. Spencer Williams did this film, and it's realistically based. So a part of the tradition that I talked about, John Mosley coming from this long tradition, you also had independent black filmmakers. And oftentimes their films didn't make it to major screens, but you had black theaters, especially in the South, where you would see these films. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film by Julie Dash called Daughters of the Dust. The baptism that she uses in her film was actually taken from this film. So there's a whole filmography around independent black film. Another film was The Flying Ace, and you can see here, you know, that it shows a very proud African-American man who served in the military. Just 8 years after John Mosley was born, D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, is released. This racist film included the stereotypical character of the brutal black buck, who was depicted as uncivilized, primitive, sexually repressed, which resulted in him being prone to physical violence. He had a wild, subhuman character, full of black rage, and was a danger to white society. In fact, Griffith's film has all of the stereotypical characters that I mentioned. Unfortunately for African Americans, Griffith's film mesmerized audiences, many who were first-time film goers, because of its magnitude and epic grandeur. Ironically, Birth of a Nation introduced new principles in film, which transformed filmmaking into an important and profitable art form. Griffith was able to capture happiness and sorrow with close-ups and other techniques. On the other side, the film, on the one side, as I mentioned, it is considered one of the films that mark a change in technology in the film industry. On the other side, the film is one of the most racist productions in the history of film. The film recreated history depicting racism and Negrophobia on the silver screen. His film served as a model for Hollywood. Eventually, blacks would play authentic, accurate, and positive roles, but the characters that Hollywood created for them fit into the stereotypical images, promoting black inferiority. This film here was another independent film. Paul Robeson played in Emperor Jones, and again, you know, it was more realistic. However, consequently, Hollywood's images of African Americans did not reflect real black life. I would just like to mention the negative impact of Birth of a Nation had on the status of black citizens throughout the United States. So, first of all, it became an excellent source of propaganda, providing false interpretation of the South, the Civil War, and Reconstruction from the viewpoint of a racist and white supremacist. It was viewed by millions, and I would just like to add a note there. During the time that the film came out, it was a time when there was a flood of immigrants coming from Europe who had never seen any African American people before, and to see this grand film, and you can imagine what their impressions would be. It was a setback for the African American struggle for fair treatment, equality, justice, and protection under the United States law. Blacks experienced a decline in their hard-earned status. The film had a negative impact on race relations. On December 4th, 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was rechartered in Fulton County, Georgia Superior Court. And by the 1920s, an estimated 4 million Americans had joined the Ku Klux Klan. In 1915, lynchings, which had been on the decline in the United States, reached their highest peak since 1908, a year after John Mosley was born. Mosley, here's some other images of Paul Robeson. Okay. Mosley was a witness to both the good and the bad in American society. He made a conscious decision to highlight the African American experience, often as an observer participant, visually chronicling many changes in politics, culture, sports, and fashion from the late 1930s to the late 1960s. He attended many athletic events, from field and track to baseball, boxing, and basketball. His photographs were taken in Philadelphia and also Atlantic City, New Jersey. But Mosley also worked in New York, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. He photographed many of the prominent figures in the African American community, including Marian Anderson, which I have an image of her here, Marian Anderson, Martin Luther King, another image of Martin Luther King, Paul Robeson. This is Paul Robeson with Julian Bond when he was a child. This was actually taken at Lincoln University. Julian Bond's father was the first African-American president at Lincoln University. Calloway, there's Calloway. Calloway again. And once again, you see these entertainers. What he captures is that they were accessible. You see their Callaways with a group of young people. W.E.B. Du Bois again. Langston Hughes in front of the Pyramid Club with a whole group of members. Langston Hughes again. And Catherine Dunham. As well as larger American society, he captured photographs. Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Grace Kelly. It was Mosley's intention to represent his proud heritage and to rightfully portray African Americans in a positive manner during a difficult time of racism and segregation. In this portion of the presentation, I would like to provide you with an accurate view of African Americans captured by John W. Mosley. Before I show the photographs that I selected, I would like to mention that I do not contend that the selected photographic images are the only images of African Americans in Philadelphia. Nor do they represent totally the African American community, because the African American community was not monolithic, and that's a myth that gets promoted. It's not monolithic, and it was very diverse. I chose images that support my view of Mosley as a cultural worker who eradicated the pathological model used to describe life in African American urban communities from the late 1930s through the 60s. Some of the earliest images captured by Mosley were of Chicken Bone Beach. And this is one image. And just to give you a little background, in 1904, the White Citizen League in Atlantic City decided to introduce segregation in Atlantic City. They posted a notice prohibiting black beachgoers from the beach area between Massachusetts and Arkansas avenues. Blacks responded by ignoring the ban. But when the new hotels were built, the restriction was enforced. Their intent was to relegate blacks to the colored beach between Mississippi and Missouri avenues. Through their creativity and resilience, the black citizens, Chicken Bone Beach blossomed into a popular resort. And these are some of the images. Black vacationers had a good time because the beach was full of life. It was a safe place where they relaxed, ate soul food, drank delicious beverages, listened to music, played in the ocean, sunbathed, and interacted with prominent personalities of the black community, like Joe Louis, Sammy Davis, or Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, to name a few. Here is an image of Dr. Barnes, Albert Barnes at Lincoln. I had shown one earlier of Alan Locke. This is the same conference. It was one of the first conferences on Africa. There he is again, Dr. Barnes. This one also contains Judge Raymond Pace Alexander was there. He also took images of baseball. Here in Philadelphia, we had the Philadelphia Stars. There was also a baseball team called the Black Meteors. And one of the things, I had the opportunity to interview Benjamin Kane, who was the manager of the Black Meteors, and he said that was a major form of entertainment and a way for blacks to make money on concessions and so forth. So you have John Drew here, who was also important, the man in the middle with the hat on. And there's a whole history. I'm not going to try to give you the history of everything, but hopefully you'll take a look and find out more. He also captured jazz. And this image here, the guy on the trumpet is Gaines. That's Charlie Gaines's son. And Charlie Gaines was called Old Devil. In fact, him and Langston Hughes were really good friends. Here's an image of Club Harlem, which is no more. If you go down on Kentucky Avenue, where there was a strip there, there's nothing there now. So thank God for John W. Mosley. Image of Count Basie here in Philadelphia during World War II down at the USO on South Broad Street. Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington again. And this is just a shot of some musicians, unidentified. Benny Goodman with Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton. Billie Holiday down at the USO on South Broad Street during World War II. Image of women during World War II. Here are some images of African American activities during World War II, promoting the sale of war bonds. That's R.R. Wright Sr., who founded the bank, Citizens Bank. So, Ruth Hare's grandfather. Yeah. Here's an image of some of the women. When you talk about Rosie the Riveter, there were African American women too who were working during the Second World War. Here's some of the activities again. One of the important things, I think, when he captured the men in the military, oftentimes when you see films in Hollywood that talk about the First and Second World War, how many African Americans do you see in the films? But through John Mosley's record, we have them. Here's some of the, in the Navy. Navy again. Navy. Army parade. And this one, does anybody know who this is? Exactly, thank you. Cecil Moore was a Montford Point Marine, so was my dad, but at any rate, this is Cecil B. Moore early on here in Philadelphia. And they were the first black Marines, by the way, the Montford Pointers. Here's the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Protests against poll tax, lynching, and so forth. Another protest. Again, Billy Eckstine and Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Nat King Cole. And Mosley took hundreds of pictures at the pen relays. And here's just one image. But when you look at the images, they also speak the style. We just look at them for hours, and look at the women, you know, they're dressed really sharp. Here's some of the scenes of the competition. Wilma Rudolph. And these are just regular scenes. This here is a scene of Samuel Evans, who is known to be the godfather of Philadelphia. He lived to be 106. We have his collection at the Blockson Collection. Joe Louis at the Christian Street Y. Pyramid Club, okay. The Pyramid Club, its motto was, "While we live, let us live." I wanted to share an account that appeared in the Philadelphia Tribune on March 6, 1941. There's an image actually in the catalog that you have from the exhibition, and it goes as follows. Quote, "The perfect combination was achieved on last Sunday afternoon when breathtaking masterpieces by early and contemporary artists of the Negro race were placed on exhibition in the spacious and perfectly illuminated rooms and hallways of the Pyramid Club, 1517 Girard Avenue, under the guidance of Humbert Howard, who serves as that club's art director." End quote. Among the guests that appeared were Dr. Alan Locke, which you saw the images earlier, professor of philosophy at Howard University, and Alan Freelon, assistant art supervisor of the Philadelphia Public Schools. Just to not to get distracted, but it seems that in 1941, art was important in the public schools. Isn't that nice? Okay. The article continued, quote, "Both of these speakers succeeded to give the mixed audience present valuable nuggets of information concerning art and its limitations when an artist happens to be a Negro. Locke and Freelon also stressed the importance of encouragement to be given to our youngest artists of today, for upon their successes or failures to be fittingly recognized rests the whole future of this race's progress in the field," end quote. The exhibit included the works of course, Humbert Howard, John Wilder, William Tasker, Doc Thrash, Samuel Brown, Raymond Seth, Henry Ossawa Tanner's images were on display on loan by a Mrs. Braun, one of the pyramid's white patrons, and also Lewis Tanner Moore. For the occasion, which I thought was interesting, formally gowned girl guides guided guests through the exhibit, and the exhibit was hung by a William C. Paul. These are images at the Pyramid Club. Everyone knows who that is in the middle? Romare Bearden. And then, let me see if Humbert Howard and Romare Bearden. Dr. Jarrick, who was president of the Pyramid Club at the time, and this is one of the Logans. Okay. Here's another image. One of the things I found fascinating about this period is, see the hats? Everybody wore hats, beautiful hats. Again, this is a group in front of a church. Another church scene. The Philadelphia Cotillion. Eugene Wayman Jones was in charge of the Philadelphia Cotillion, and they had events year-round, and this cotillion, and you can see how beautifully everyone was dressed. Here's another view of the Philadelphia Cotillion. Apex Beauty School. Sarah Spencer Washington, who was actually in Atlantic City, she had the Apex Beauty School. Here's some of the students. And again, you see how they're dressed and the hats. Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital and Training School, which was founded by Dr. Nathan Moselle in 1895 here in Philadelphia. And he founded the hospital in order, after he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, in order to give opportunities to African American doctors and also to be able to give opportunities and training to African American nurses. And a lot of this history, students need to really know about this. But, 1895, just think about that. That's important. Once again, the Elks and the Masons, he took many pictures of different events. This is outside of the theater, African Americans coming from the opera. And in fact, there was a black opera company here in Philadelphia called Dramu. And there's lots of images. I couldn't include everything. You all will have to come down to the Blockson Collection and visit. Spend the day. Okay, now this part, images of African American women during World War II. With regards to the following images that I'm getting ready to show you, which is going to conclude my presentation, I conducted a survey back in the early 90s for a presentation that I was doing at MIT for a conference entitled Black Women in the Academy Defending Our Name, 1894 to 1994. I interviewed women in Philadelphia when I found these images from this period, women who were familiar with these images. And one of the women had the following to say about these images. And these images actually appeared also in the Pyramid Journal. We have those Pyramid Journals in the Blockson collection. You thought Madonna was the first, right? These are some of the images. And before I go on, she said, these photographs are just beautiful. Back then, there was a real appreciation for the body. These photographs are works of art, end quote. Through my research, I found that often the young women who appeared in these photographs were sent to charm schools by their parents to learn proper etiquette, pose, and grace. Others came from working-class families. These photographs appeared in African American publications to celebrate the beauty of African American women. They also served an intimate function. African American women had these photographs taken to provide their husbands and boyfriends with fanciful yet personal images of themselves. During World War II era, they also countered the stereotypical images of the mammy, the tragic mulatto, and the Jezebel. African American women were empowered by creating their own images through photographs taken by John Mosley. Needless to say, Mosley was admired by these women. This is Miss Sepia in 1945, and her daughter visited the Blockson Collection this past summer. Dolores Fairfax, the daughter of Frank Fairfax, who was a band leader here in Philadelphia and also a member of Musicians Protective Union Local 274, who came to Philadelphia in the 30s from Fairfax, Virginia. Joe Lewis, again with some of the Miss Sepia, and, this guy here, Ray Bryant, he was an MC, and oftentimes he was mistaken for not being black, so he got more opportunities too. Okay. And this is me. Although I tried to include, I think one of the women I included here. Yeah, and there were a couple other ones. Or maybe Leslie took them out, yeah. But once again, let me leave it there. One of the things when I took these images to the conference during an era of feminism, like some of the women went ballistic with these images. They were like, what do you mean? These are but no, by interviewing the women, I found that the women were the ones that were creating the image. And so, like I had to say that possibly the women back in the 40s were more comfortable with their bodies than we are today. But, it was... Okay, so in conclusion, John W. Mosley used his photography as a venue to deconstruct, to dispel, and to eradicate myths and harmful stereotypes. In the process, he provided African Americans with a sense of pride by capturing their humanity. His photographs educate us about African American life in Philadelphia and surrounding areas. Mosley devoted his life to documenting the African American community. He was very low-key, hardworking, and highly intelligent. His work is very important as it provides us with a window into the past. We can revisit the 1930s through the late 60s. We are indebted to John W. Mosley because he leaves us with images to allow for accurate representations and interpretations of African Americans in spite of the assaults during the period of his work with negative and grotesque false images. Mosley walked, photographed, developed, and preserved the subjects that he loved, his people, their traditions, their values, family gatherings, social and cultural events, their everyday life in both interior and exterior settings. He also captured the attributes they held dear: strength, unity, stability, style, and change. His legacy and contributions to American history, social history, and urban history is that he left us not only with a record of a viable, intricate, and complex network of African American associations, organizations, and institutions, but also the people who organized and maintained their communities. Mosley's visual record speaks to his resilience, courage, dedication, and love. And, quote, "It is a testimony to the existence of an African American humanity that warms the heart and souls as it stimulates the eye," end quote. Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments?
Yes, when did he die?
In 1968. I actually have one of his books up here. John W. Mosley.
Okay. Was he ever a paid staff photographer for any of the newspapers, or was he paid by the photos?
He was paid by the photos, but keep in mind that he had his own studio, and he took photographs not only for the different newspapers for events, but he took photographs of people's weddings, family reunions. I mean, they hired him, so he was very busy. He worked 7 days a week, so he did well. He was well known.
Thank you very much. This was a very informative presentation, and I very much appreciate having been here to listen to you. I have a question. You may actually have gone over this already, but when you were showing the films that came out, it seemed that any film that tried to set the record right was an independent film.
Yes.
And I wonder, were those independent films produced and directed by African American people or white directors, and if they were African American, where did the support come from? Even today, independent films struggle. So it's kind of interesting to see that these were being created.
Right. Well, for the most part, they were African American. I mentioned Oscar Micheaux. I didn't have an image of him, but one of the films, he wrote a book called The Homesteader, and he made money off of that. And then he created a film around the Homesteader, but he took the lead on independent film. There is actually a well, there's 2 books that I know of that chronicle his life. There were others also. And there's also a documentary called Midnight Ramble, which is very good. But even today, one of the independent filmmakers of today, he's a professor at Howard University. His name is Haile Gerima. I don't know how many of you have seen his film Sankofa. And I had the opportunity to interview him. And he says, it's not just African Americans. Any story that doesn't fit the Hollywood model, and that model, well, we see it all the time. So Haile Gerima was out at UCLA during the 60s, and with him, Charles Burnett was there, Julie Dash, and others. But you not only had African Americans, you had Chicanos, you had Asian Americans, you had women who were just, started making these independent films because they wanted to be able to tell their story. And so, like some of the filmmakers, they get the money, like Haile Gerima, he teaches, and then he goes, I get hit up by him every now and then when he does his fundraisers for his film, which, through social media, it's a little easier. But I was amazed because I took a institute through the National Endowment for the Humanities on independent black film, and I went in there thinking, I was all that. I knew all these films. When I went in there, I realized I really didn't even know anything. And so, like, you really have to search for these films, but there is a body of these films, and they're still being made today. The problem is you have a place like the Ritz downtown who shows films, but other than that, like the larger theaters, they won't show the films because in their mind, they don't think they'll make money. And so, in a sense, Hollywood just continues to perpetuate these stereotypes. And, like when we talk about, if we could relate it to today, like these stereotypes about the brutal buck, and we're looking at the movement of Black Lives Matter. Like when the police are saying, it sounded like this stereotype to me, So there's a lot that needs to be done to continue, and there are those who are working to change this, but it's, what is it, the movie industrial complex we're dealing with, yes?
Thank you for being a voice for this change that really does need to finally come. And also, I was wondering if the book by Mr. Mosley that you showed us briefly is available at the Blockson
Yes.
Foundation, or is it also available here? I'd like to get it today for my father, who is a photographer of 90 years of age, so you can imagine the compilation that he has, and I'd like him to be inspired, by someone who may have had they may have had common ground in many ways.
Yes, I have the book, and I'd like to talk to you about your father. Is he in Philadelphia?
He's in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Well,
but it's so easy to communicate,
Right.
and I know he would love, love, love to meet you.
okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Now, I'm familiar with Vandersea and Gordon Parks. So where is Mosley on the timeline with these other photographers?
Well, Vandersea, he's earlier, documenting in Harlem. But in a sense, I would argue, like in any city, that's the thing, like with Mosley, where you have any urban community, you're going to have these photographers. I mentioned that he was part of this long tradition. So, he was taking them from the 30s, but Vandersea was earlier.
Okay, and Gordon Parks?
And Gordon Parks would probably be around the same time as Mosley.
Okay, because I noticed that Gordon Parks, he and Vandersea too, they covered a wide range of black life in the black community. They photographed people in the working class community and as well as the elitist community. But I'm noticing that Mosley, his photographs were really, mostly from what you've shown us, from the upper class black community.
Well,
And I found that a bit troubling.
well, that's what I mentioned at the beginning. I selected the photographs. I mean, we have over 300,000 images and negatives. So I would invite you to come. But in terms of Gordon Parks, like Gordon Parks, he was doing photography for magazines, like, Life magazine. I mean, that's when he really made a name for himself, and then he started to delve into film too. The Learning Tree, you know, so I think they were probably taking different paths, and Mosley was more local, Philadelphia, whereas Gordon Parks became internationally renowned because of Life magazine and the other types of things he was doing. And Van der Zee, you know, he was documenting what was going on in Harlem, but during the time he was doing it later, you know, he's recognized, just like Mosley is for Philadelphia, Van der Zee was for Harlem. So.
Anybody else? Just to speak to that, if you go to the Blockson archives online and you look up John Mosley, there's, I mean, if you start scrolling through those photographs, you'll see that he took pictures of everybody, of all classes, and so on and so forth.
I took a Black history course with Charles Blockson.
Okay.
I guess it was Temple, many, many years ago. And he took us to this collection, which of course I never forgot. And I remember him speaking about Paul Robeson and the big role that he played.
Yeah, Paul Robeson was one of his heroes. I mean, if you come to the collection, there's an image that an artist did that includes him and Paul Robeson together in the image. And we have a large collection of his materials too,
Yeah.
programs, photographs, a whole host of things.
Anybody else? I want to thank Dr. Turner. That was
Okay, thank
wonderful.
you.
Just so that everybody knows, we do have 4 printed images of Mosley up on our Del Bueno balcony. We also have videos because we at Woodmere were so taken with Mosley's photographic story. And so it's hard to get to, but on the iPad behind all of the sound equipment, there's John Mosley and his photographs, and then the way he told the story, the way we interpret the way he told the story of civil rights in Philadelphia through the 60s, because he dies in 1969, is it? 68? 8. And then over by the stairwell, we have 2 iPads. We have Mosley and as staff photographer for the Pyramid Club, and Mosley and Pearl Bailey in Philadelphia. So he has enriched our knowledge of the story of Philadelphia and artists greatly, so thank you. There is wine and cheese in our historic galleries, so please join us there and you'll have a chance to talk to Dr. Turner even more. Thank you.